The firebase sat 30 miles inside enemy territory, surrounded by mountains that swallowed radio signals and hope in equal measure. Lieutenant Marcus Webb pressed himself against the sandbag wall as another mortar round shook dust from the plywood roof overhead. 12 Navy SEALs, 2 Air Force JTACs, and a CIA analyst who wouldn't give his real name, all trapped in a compound that smelled like diesel fuel and imminent death. Webb had called for close air support 40 minutes ago. The response had been 2 F-16s that made a single pass, dropped ordnance half a click away from the actual target, then vanished back toward friendly airspace when their fuel ran low. Now the enemy was closing from 3 sides, and the only thing standing between Webb's team and a very public execution video was whoever answered the next radio call. Technical Sergeant Rains, the senior JTAC, had his hand pressed to his headset, face tight with concentration. "Hog inbound," he said. "Single aircraft, ETA 6 minutes." Webb felt his stomach drop. 1. Against an enemy force that Intel estimated at 200 fighters with vehicle-mounted weapons and probably MANPADs. The Warthog was tough, sure, but one plane couldn't hold off an army. He'd seen what happened when ground attack aircraft got swarmed. He'd watched gun camera footage of titanium bathtubs falling out of the sky trailing smoke. "Call sign," Webb asked, because sometimes you could tell from the voice whether you were getting a seasoned combat pilot or some kid fresh out of Luke Air Force Base. Rains listened for a moment, then pulled his hand away from his ear like he'd heard wrong. "Jester 2-1, he said slowly. "Single ship." Something in his expression made Webb's chest tight. "Problem." Rains shook his head, but his eyes said otherwise. "No problem, LT, just. Didn't expect that call sign to still be flying." The mountains swallowed sound before it could echo. Webb could hear the distinctive crack of AK fire getting closer, the heavier thump of a DSHK machine gun somewhere to the east. His men were down to their last magazines. The CIA analyst had stopped pretending to be calm and was now openly checking his sidearm every 30 seconds. Then Webb heard it, a sound like the sky itself tearing open. Not the scream of jets, but something lower, angrier, a turbofan howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Captain Natalia Voss brought her A-10C Thunderbolt II down through 8,000 feet and felt the familiar weight of gravity pressing her into the ejection seat. Below her, the Hindu Kush stretched out in shades of brown and gray, ancient and utterly indifferent to the small, violent dramas playing out in its valleys. She'd been flying this route for so long she could navigate by the shadows of peaks alone. 26 years in the cockpit, 4 wars, 362 combat missions. And still, every time she crossed into hostile airspace, her hands found the same ritual: left hand checking throttle position, right hand brushing the photograph tucked into the edge of her instrument panel. Her daughter's face, 7 years old, frozen in time. "Jester 2-1, Nightmare 2-6, authenticate Tango Lima," Rain's voice crackled through her headset. "All business, no warmth." Voss had stopped expecting warmth years ago. "Nightmare, Jester authenticates Victor Hotel. Single ship Hog, full combat load, playtime 2+30. She kept her voice level, professional. "Let them think whatever they wanted to think. Pass your situation." There was a pause on the other end. She could almost hear the JTAC processing what he'd just heard. Female voice, old call sign, single aircraft. The 3 things guaranteed to make ground forces nervous. When Rains came back on, his tone had shifted slightly, not quite dismissive but careful, like he was explaining something to someone who might not understand. "Jester, we've got ticks on 3 sides, danger close to friendly positions. Enemy force estimated 200 plus, with technical vehicles and heavy weapons. We need immediate suppression, how copy?" Voss rolled her aircraft into a gentle bank, bringing her nose around toward the coordinates Rains had transmitted. Through her canopy she could see thin threads of smoke rising from the valley floor, the universal signature of things burning that shouldn't be. "Solid copy, Nightmare. Jester's tally compound, tally smoke. Proceed with 9 line." She brought her altitude down to 7,000, felt the air thicken around her wings. The A-10 responded like it always did, not graceful, not pretty, just absolutely certain, like an old truck that knew every pothole on the road home. While Rains transmitted the 9-line close air support brief, Voss ran her eyes across her weapons panel. AGM-65 Mavericks on stations 3 and 9, Hydra rockets on stations 5 and 7, and beneath her nose, the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, 4,000 rounds of 30 ammunition, each projectile the size of a milk bottle, depleted uranium cores that could punch through tank armor like tissue paper. She'd been carrying this gun across half the world's conflict zones since before some of these ground troops were born. Nightmare has friendlies marked with V-17 panels north side of compound, Rains continued. Enemy positions are marked with IR strobes. Acknowledge you have night vision capability. Voss almost smiled at that. Almost. Negative on NVG's Nightmare. I'll be running this attack visually. Another pause. Longer this time. Jester. Be advised enemy has displayed anti-air capability. Recommend you stay above 5,000 AGL. Now Voss did smile, though nobody could see it behind her oxygen mask. Stay above 5,000. Stay safe. Stay alive to fly another day. That's what they all said, the ones who thought warfare could be managed like a risk assessment spreadsheet. She pushed her stick forward and felt her warthog's nose drop toward the earth. The altimeter spun backward, 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The ground rushed up to meet her, details emerging from the blur. She could see the compound now, the beige sandbags and plywood structures, the tiny figures of American forces pressed against whatever cover they could find. And surrounding them, dozens of fighting positions, vehicles, enemy combatants moving with the confidence of predators closing on wounded prey. Jesters in hot from the north, Voss transmitted. Her right hand settled on the weapon's release. Her left made micro-adjustments to throttle and trim. This was the part where everything else fell away. The doubt, the exhaustion, the knowledge that she was 52 years old flying a plane designed before most of her squadron mates were born. All that mattered was the geometry of angels and velocity, and the precise moment when weapon met target. She pickled off her first Maverick at 3,000 feet, watched the missile leap away from her wing trailing white smoke. It tracked true, guided by the heat signature of an enemy technical vehicle. The explosion bloomed orange and black against the tan earth. Webb watched the missile impact from behind his sandbag wall and felt something loosen in his chest. The technical that had been pouring fire into their western perimeter simply ceased to exist, replaced by a rolling fireball and scattered debris. Before he could process it, a second missile screamed down from the sky, erasing another vehicle on the eastern approach. The enemy fire slackened noticeably. Men who had been advancing with impunity suddenly remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable. Nightmare Jester, BDA on 2 vehicles destroyed. Voss' voice came through steady as a metronome. Proceeding to strafe enemy positions. Stand by. Webb looked at Rains, whose expression had shifted from careful neutrality to something approaching wonder. She's not staying above 5,000, Rains said unnecessarily. They could both see the A-10 now, a gray predator dropping through 3,000 feet, wings level, nose pointed at a cluster of enemy fighting positions like an arrow seeking flesh. No, Webb agreed, she's definitely not. Voss lined up her first gun run with the kind of precision that only came from doing something thousands of times until it became autonomic. The targeting pipper settled over a machine gun nest that had been hammering the compound's north wall. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life with a sound like the earth splitting open. 70 rounds per second tore through the morning air, each depleted uranium penetrator finding dirt and flesh and weapon, and making no distinction between them. The recoil slowed her airspeed noticeably. The tracers arced down in a perfect line of destruction. When she pulled off target and began her climbing turn, the machine gun nest was silent. Good hits, Rains called, excitement creeping into his professional tone despite himself. Jester, we've got enemy personnel fleeing east toward the tree line. Can you engage? Voss was already rolling into her next attack angle. She'd seen the runners, watched them break cover like rabbits fleeing a hawk's shadow. Nightmare gestures tally runners coming back around. Her hands moved across controls worn smooth by decades of use. Throttle forward, rudder pressure. Slight back stick to arrest her descent. The A-10 responded like an extension of her thoughts. The enemy fighters had made it halfway to the tree line when Voss's Hydra rockets found them. 7 rockets, ripple-fired from her left wing pod, spreading across the hillside in a pattern that left no gaps and no mercy. The explosions walked through the fleeing men like the footsteps of an angry god. Webb turned away from the sight, not from squeamishness. He'd seen worse, but from the sudden understanding that they were watching someone who had perfected their craft through repetition that bordered on art. This wasn't just close air support. This was something else entirely, something old and ruthless and utterly competent. Voss brought her A-10 around for another pass, checking her fuel state and weapons remaining. She had plenty of both. The enemy had stopped advancing and started dying. This was the part where they usually broke and ran. She'd seen it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, half a dozen other places that blurred together in memory. There was always a moment when a ground force realized that the sky had turned against them, when the calculus of risk and reward shifted so dramatically that survival became more important than victory. Jester Nightmare enemy force appears to be withdrawing, Rains transmitted. His voice had warmed considerably. Outstanding work. We're no longer taking effective fire. Voss acknowledged with a curt copy and continued her orbit overhead. She wouldn't leave until she was certain. Wouldn't bug out just because the immediate threat had diminished. That's what the young pilots did, drop their ordnance, claim their kills, race back to the debrief with their adrenaline still singing. She'd learned different. Learned that the enemy was patient, that they'd wait for the aircraft to leave before starting again. So she stayed. For 20 minutes she circled the compound like a protective angel with titanium feathers and a cannon for a sword. She checked every tree line, every depression in the earth, every shadow that might conceal a patient fighter with an RPG. Her eyes swept her instruments constantly: fuel state, engine temps, hydraulic pressure, the thousands of small details that kept an old aircraft flying. The A-10 had been her companion through more combat than any human friend. It had brought her home from missions that should have been fatal. She trusted it absolutely. Jester Nightmare, we're clear to begin exfil procedures, Rains finally called. Request you remain on station until extract birds arrive. Voss clicked her mic twice in acknowledgement. Of course she'd remain. That's what you did. You stayed until the job was complete, until the people you'd been sent to protect were safely away. It didn't matter that she'd been airborne for 4 hours already. Didn't matter that her back ached from the ejection seat or that her eyes burned from staring at the landscape. What mattered was the mission. Webb and his team began their extract procedures with the efficiency of men who'd just been given an unexpected second chance at life. They moved quickly but carefully, gathering equipment, preparing their wounded. 3 men hit by shrapnel but nothing fatal, for helicopter evacuation. Webb kept glancing up at the orbiting overhead, its distinctive silhouette somehow reassuring despite its brutal functionality. "Who is that?" he asked Rains while they worked. The JTAC shrugged, but his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Jester's a call sign from old operations in the Balkans," Rains said finally. "There was a pilot who flew it during the Kosovo campaign, made a name taking out Serbian armor columns. They say she flew missions that should have gotten her shot down a dozen times." He paused, securing a radio antenna. "They also say she stopped caring about making rank or playing politics after her kid died. Just kept flying combat missions because it was the only thing that made sense anymore." Webb absorbed this quietly. It explained something about the calm efficiency he'd just witnessed, about the way that pilot had pressed attacks without hesitation or showboating. This wasn't someone trying to prove anything. This was someone who'd already lost everything that could be taken. The extract helicopters, 2 MH-60s, arrived 45 minutes later, their rotors beating the air into submission as they flared for landing. Voss maintained her orbit, watching the SEALs board with their wounded and their equipment and their lives intact. She felt nothing particular about it. No pride, no satisfaction. Just the quiet confirmation that she'd done what she'd been sent to do. The helicopters lifted off in a storm of dust and noise, noses tilting forward as they accelerated toward friendly territory. Jester 2-1, Nightmare 2-6, all personnel extracted safely, Rains transmitted. Thanks for the save. You ever need anything, call me direct. Voss allowed herself a small acknowledgement. Copy all, Nightmare, Jester's RTB. She turned her nose toward home, adding power, climbing back toward the thin, cold air where the A-10 ran most efficiently. Behind her, the battlefield fell silent. Bodies and burning vehicles marked where the fight had been. By tomorrow, locals would have stripped anything valuable. By next week, the char marks would start fading under sun and wind. By next year, only the earth would remember. The flight back to Bagram took 90 minutes. Voss used the time to run her post-combat checklist, noting the rounds expended, the missiles fired, the system's performance, everything mechanical and routine. She didn't think about the enemy fighters her cannon had torn apart. Didn't replay the attack runs in her mind looking for moments of grace or error. After enough missions, combat became less about individual engagements and more about patterns, threat assessment, target prioritization, weapons employment, battle damage assessment. The mechanics of keeping people alive by making other people dead. She landed as the sun was dropping behind the mountains, the golden hour light turning everything soft and forgiving. Her crew chief met her aircraft with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd serviced this particular warthog through hundreds of sorties. Staff Sergeant Torres was 28, young enough to be Voss's son, old enough to have stopped asking stupid questions about her age or gender. He just maintained the aircraft and trusted her to bring it back relatively intact. "How'd she fly, ma'am?" Torres asked, already running his hands over panels and inspection points looking for damage. Voss climbed down from the cockpit slowly, feeling every year of her age in the stiffness of her joints. "Like she always does," she replied. "Kept me alive, kept the mission clean." Torres grinned at that. He'd heard the same response after probably 200 missions. "That's what we like to hear. I'll have her turned around by 0400 if you're flying tomorrow." Voss nodded. She was always flying tomorrow. The debrief took an hour. Voss sat in the briefing room with 2 intelligence officers and the squadron operations officer, walking through her mission timeline, describing enemy positions and capabilities, assessing the threat level for future operations in that sector. She kept her language clinical and precise. The intel officers asked good questions, took careful notes. They were professionals. They didn't waste time on bullshit commentary about her gender or age. They just wanted the information she'd gathered, while keeping American forces alive. Major Richards, the operations officer, lingered after the intel people left. He was 40, fit, a former F-16 pilot who transitioned to the A-10 and discovered he preferred the grittier mission set. He respected Voss in the way that combat pilots respected each other, based purely on capability and mission effectiveness. "Webb's team sent a message through channels," Richards said. "They want to know who pulled them out. I told them operational security means we don't discuss pilot identities with ground forces." Voss appreciated that, the anonymity, the distance. "They also said it was some of the finest close air support they'd seen in 15 years of combat," Richards continued. "The JTAC used the word surgical." Voss shrugged. Praise meant nothing. Awards meant nothing. She had a wall full of medals back home in a box she hadn't opened in a decade. "They're alive," she said simply. "That's what matters." Richards nodded slowly. He understood. Some pilots flew for glory, some flew for their country. Some flew because they didn't know how to do anything else. And some flew because the cockpit was the only place where the past couldn't follow them. Voss walked back to her quarters through the dusty twilight of Bagram Air Base. Around her, the enormous military machine hummed with its perpetual activity, cargo planes landing and taking off, ground crews servicing aircraft, soldiers moving between mission and rest in endless rotation. She'd been part of this machine for so long that she sometimes forgot what civilian life even looked like. Forgot that most people went days or weeks without thinking about death or violence. Forgot that for the vast majority of humanity, the sky was just weather and birds, not a battlefield to be controlled and exploited. Her quarters were small and austere. Single room, single bed, personal items kept to absolute minimum. She showered quickly, the water barely warm, washing away the sweat and stress of combat. In the mirror, she looked older than 52. Gray hair cropped short for practical reasons. Lines around her eyes from squinting at instruments and horizons. A scar along her jawline from an ejection 15 years ago that she barely remembered. She'd stopped caring what she looked like around the same time. She'd stopped caring about most things. The photograph sat on her small desk, same picture she kept in her cockpit. Her daughter Alina at 7, laughing at something just outside the frame. Bright eyes full of confidence in a world that made sense. That photograph was 18 years old now. Alina would have been 25. Would have been finishing medical school or traveling or falling in love or doing any of the 1,000 things that living people did. Instead, she was a name on a headstone and a hole in Voss's chest that never quite closed. The cancer had been aggressive and absolutely indifferent to hope or prayer or any of the bargains Voss had tried to make with a universe that didn't negotiate. 11 months from diagnosis to death. Voss had taken emergency leave, sat beside hospital beds, held Alina's hand through treatments that destroyed her small body while failing to destroy the thing killing her. In the end, Alina had died quietly, slipping away while Voss was asleep in the chair beside her bed. She'd missed it. Missed the single most important moment of her daughter's life, because she'd been too exhausted to keep her eyes open. After that, returning to flying had been the only thing that made sense. Her ex-husband had called her cold, unfeeling, accused her of running away from grief. Maybe he was right. But the cockpit was the only place where Voss felt like she had any control, where her actions had clear consequences, where she could protect people even though she'd failed to protect the one person who mattered most. So she flew. Mission after mission, year after year, long past the point where most pilots retired to desk jobs or civilian aviation. Sleep came eventually, though it was never restful. Voss dreamed of flight paths and targeting solutions, of her daughter's laugh echoing through aircraft radio static, of missions that ended wrong, of canopies shattering and ground rushing up, and the moment of impact that never quite came before she woke. At 0330 her alarm sounded. She rose, dressed, made her way to the operations center to check the day's mission schedule. Her name was there as always. Another compound needed support. Another group of Americans surrounded by people trying to kill them. Another day in the Warthog. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Voss flew, fought, returned. Torres maintained her aircraft. Richards handled the administrative overhead. The war continued its grinding rhythm, utterly indifferent to individuals or their stories. But something had shifted slightly after the Firebase rescue. Word had gotten around, the way it always did in military communities despite official channels and operational security. The SEALs Web commanded had talked. The JTAC Reigns had talked. And the story that emerged was being told, and retold in that mythologizing way that military stories always were. The old female pilot in the A-10. The one who flew like she had nothing to lose. The one with the call sign from the Balkans Wars. Nobody knew her real name, or if they did, they kept it respectfully quiet. But the story spread through Firebase and forward operating base and headquarters, passed along in emails and sat phone calls, and the whispered conversations that happened when soldiers gathered to compare their brushes with death. And as the story spread, something about Voss began to change in the minds of the men and women she protected from the sky. Lieutenant Webb's team got pinned down again 3 weeks later, different valley but same circumstances. Underestimated enemy force, deteriorating tactical situation, air support requested with increasing urgency. This time when Rains made the call and heard Jester 2-1 respond, Webb actually smiled. "That's our guardian angel," he told his men. We're going to be fine. And they were. Voss arrived with the same methodical violence, the same absolute competence, the same refusal to quit until every American was safely extracted. She never asked for thanks, never deviated from professional radio protocol, just did the job and disappeared back into the sky. Captain Mitchell, a Marine Company commander operating out of Camp Leatherneck, requested Jester specifically after his convoy got ambushed near the Pakistan border. He'd heard the stories, wanted the pilot who would stay on station until the mission was complete, not the one who'd drop ordnance and bug out when things got hot. The request went up through channels and got approved because Voss's combat effectiveness numbers were undeniable. She flew the mission, eliminated the ambush force, covered the convoy's withdrawal. Mitchell tried to thank her personally via radio afterward. She cut him off mid-sentence. "Just doing my job, Nightmare 47, Jester's off." That was all. But Mitchell talked about it anyway. Told anyone who'd listen about the A-10 pilot who treated close air support like a sacred duty, who flew with a precision and ferocity that seemed impossible from a single aircraft. The legend grew. Young pilots heard the stories and tried to fly like Jester. Ground forces began specifically requesting her call sign for dangerous missions. And slowly, grudgingly, even the fighter pilot community, notorious for its dismissal of the slow and low Warthog, began acknowledging that something exceptional was happening in the Afghan mountains. Major General Kessler, commander of air operations for the regional command, noticed the pattern in his briefings. One pilot's name appearing with unusual frequency in post-mission reports, always with superlative assessments from ground commanders. He pulled Voss's file, read through her 26-year service record, saw the deployments and decorations, and the sudden drop-off in promotion velocity around the time her daughter died. He saw a pilot who'd stopped caring about career progression and started flying like someone with nothing left to lose, which made her either dangerous or invaluable, depending on how you looked at it. Kessler called her into his office on a bright May morning. Voss reported as required, standing at attention in his air-conditioned headquarters while he studied her with the calculating gaze of a general officer deciding whether to praise or reprimand. "Captain Voss," he began carefully, "your combat effectiveness is extraordinary. Your safety record, however, concerns me. You're taking risks that would get most pilots grounded." Voss met his gaze without flinching. "Respectfully, sir, I'm completing missions and bringing personnel home alive. That's the job." Kessler leaned back in his chair. He'd been a fighter pilot once before the stars and the politics and the administrative burden of command. He understood the psychology of combat flying, the way some pilots needed the edge to function. "I'm not grounding you," he said finally, "but I am putting a note in your file that you're to be monitored for operational stress, and I'm strongly suggesting that you speak with the chaplain or the mental health staff." Voss's expression didn't change. "Noted, sir." "Will there be anything else?" "Yes," Kessler said. "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for the firebase extraction and subsequent actions. You've earned it." Voss felt nothing at the words. "Another medal for another box." "Thank you, sir. Permission to return to flight status." Kessler dismissed her with a wave. After she left, he sat in his office thinking about pilots who flew like they were already dead, and whether using them was pragmatic leadership or moral failure. He never quite reached a conclusion. The recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross worked its way through the military awards bureaucracy with the speed of continental drift. Voss didn't think about it. She flew. June turned to July, turned to August, the Afghan summer blazing hot and utterly merciless. The enemy adapted their tactics, started avoiding open ground when American aircraft were overhead, learned to scatter and hide when they heard the distinctive sound of turbofan engines. But they couldn't avoid contact forever, and when they did engage, Voss was often there to make them regret it. A platoon from the 75th Rangers got surrounded during a night raid gone wrong. They called for help at 0200, darkness absolute, enemy closing from multiple directions. Most pilots avoided night close air support, too dangerous, too many variables, too easy to hit friendlies by mistake. Voss launched anyway, flying by instruments and instinct and the kind of spatial awareness that came from spending more hours in a cockpit than most people spent in their homes. She found the Rangers by their infrared strobes, found the enemy by their muzzle flashes, and put cannon rounds exactly where they needed to be despite darkness and confusion and the absolute chaos of a close-quarters firefight. The Rangers extracted with 1 wounded and 0 dead. Their platoon leader, Lieutenant Shaw, was 24 years old and had never seen close air support that precise. He submitted a statement through his chain of command describing Voss's actions in language usually reserved for Medal of Honor citations. "This pilot saved my entire platoon with surgical precision in conditions that most aviators wouldn't even attempt," Shaw wrote. "If there's anyone in this war who deserves recognition for sustained combat excellence, it's Jester 2-1. The statements accumulated. Ground commanders, JTACs, infantry platoon leaders, special operations teams, all adding their voices to a chorus of respect that was unusual for any pilot and almost unprecedented for an A-10 driver who avoided publicity. Voss remained unaware of most of it. She flew her missions, returned to base, filed her reports, slept poorly, and repeated. The pattern was sustainable because it was all she had. The cockpit was her church. The missions were her absolution, and the men and women she protected from the sky were the only congregation that mattered. Staff Sergeant Torres noticed that Voss's aircraft was showing unusual wear patterns, not mechanical failures. The A-10 was famously robust, but the accumulated stress of sustained combat operations. Panels that should have been replaced less frequently needed attention. Systems that typically ran longer between services were requiring maintenance. The aircraft was being pushed hard, flown long, given missions that ground it down gradually but inexorably. Torres mentioned it to Richards during a maintenance review meeting. "She's flying like the aircraft is expendable," Torres said bluntly. "Like she's expendable, that's not sustainable." Richards knew Torres was right but wasn't sure what to do about it. You couldn't ground a pilot for being too effective. Couldn't tell someone to care more about their own survival when they were keeping other people alive. "Keep the aircraft flying," he told Torres. "I'll handle the pilot." But he didn't know how to handle someone who'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to a parent, and who flew combat missions like she was negotiating with death for terms that might finally make sense. September arrived with the subtle shift in temperature that marked the beginning of Afghanistan's fall season. The war continued. Taliban forces, knowing the American withdrawal timeline, pressed their advantages where they could. Attacks increased. American casualties ticked upward. And Voss flew, because the demand for close air support never diminished, only grew more urgent as the situation deteriorated. She was now 49 days into a 60-day deployment cycle, flying every day, sometimes twice a day, accumulating combat hours that would have exhausted pilots half her age. The mission brief on September 15th was routine in its grimness. Army infantry conducting a clearing operation near Sangin had run into a prepared enemy defensive position. Heavy casualties. Urgent close air support requested. Multiple aircraft scrambled, 2 F-16s, a B-1 bomber on station for close air support, and Voss in her Warthog. The fast movers would handle distant targets. The B-1 would provide heavy ordnance. And Voss would work the danger-close support, putting rounds exactly where they needed to be without hitting the Americans fighting 500 meters away. She arrived on station to find chaos. The radio was crowded with urgent transmissions, multiple JTACs trying to coordinate fires, ground commanders requesting immediate support. Voss sorted through the noise with the calm of long experience, identifying the most urgent threat, an enemy machine gun position that had the American forces pinned in a kill zone. "All stations, Jester 2-1 has priority traffic," she transmitted, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Nightmare 3-4, authenticate Tango Quebec." The JTAC responded immediately, recognizing the call sign. Priorities shifted to her without argument. "Nightmare Jester, pass your most urgent target," Voss said, already calculating approaches and weapons employment. The JTAC, a captain named Morrison, described the situation with the clipped urgency of someone watching men die. "Jester, we've got a fortified position bearing 090 from friendly positions, distance 470 meters. That's danger close. They're chewing us apart." Voss acknowledged and rolled into her attack. 470 meters, that was tight. Closer than most pilots would attempt. But the A-10's cannon was the most accurate close air support weapon in the American arsenal, and she'd been using it for longer than Morrison had been alive. She came in low, bracketing her approach so the rounds would impact away from friendly forces, trusting her instruments and her eyes and the muscle memory of thousands of gun runs. The GAU-8 spoke its violent language. The enemy position disintegrated under the concentrated fire. Morrison's voice came back on immediately, high and tight with relief. "Good hits, excellent hits. Friendlies no longer pinned." Voss climbed away, already looking for the next threat. This was the mission. Find the people trying to kill Americans. Remove them from the fight. Repeat until everyone made it home or she ran out of ammunition or fuel or luck. The battle lasted 4 hours. Voss stayed on station the entire time, cycling through her weapons, coordinating with other aircraft, providing the continuous support that ground forces needed when they were fighting for their lives. She put Mavericks into enemy bunkers, walked cannon fire through attacking formations, dropped her last rockets on a mortar position that was trying to range the American casualty collection point. When she finally headed home, her aircraft was almost empty, fuel gauge reading minimum reserves, weapons racks bare, ammunition counter showing less than 300 rounds remaining. Torres met her aircraft with concern etched across his face. 4 hours of sustained combat, weapons expended across the board, and Voss climbed out of the cockpit moving like someone who'd been beaten with hammers. "Ma'am, you're not going to believe this, but you've got a fuel leak in the number 2 tank," Torres said, pointing to the wet streak down her fuselage. "Probably took ground fire, small caliber, but it could have been bad." Voss looked at the leak with the dispassion of someone who'd stopped worrying about close calls years ago. "It held," she said simply. "That's all that matters. Can you fix it overnight?" Torres nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but you need to stand down tomorrow. You've been flying every day for 7 weeks. You're past due for crew rest." Voss started to argue, then realized Torres was right. Military regulations required minimum rest periods between combat missions. She'd been waiving them through force of will and cooperative scheduling, but there were limits. "Fine," she agreed. 1 day down, then back to flight status. Torres watched her walk toward debrief and worried about what would happen when this deployment ended, and Voss had to go home to whatever life she maintained outside the cockpit. The debrief that evening was attended by more people than usual. Richards was there, along with 2 lieutenant colonels from brigade staff and a captain from public affairs who was carefully not taking notes but obviously gathering information. Voss walked through her mission timeline with her usual precision, describing targets and weapons employment and battle damage assessment. When she finished, one of the lieutenant colonels leaned forward. "Captain Voss, I'm going to be direct. You've flown 72 combat missions in 49 days. Your effectiveness rating is through the roof, but you're also pushing yourself beyond reasonable limits. We need sustainable operations, not heroes burning themselves out." Voss regarded him with the flat expression that had become her default when dealing with officers who didn't fly combat missions. "Sir, I'm sustainable. I'm completing missions effectively. If you want to ground me, that's your prerogative. But while I'm grounded, Americans are going to die who might have lived if I'd been overhead." It was blunt to the point of insubordination, but it was also true, and everyone in the room knew it. The lieutenant colonel exchanged glances with his colleague. "Nobody's grounding you, Captain, but you will take your mandatory crew rest. That's non-negotiable." The next day, Voss tried to rest and found it impossible. She went to the gym, ran until her legs burned, lifted weights until her arms trembled, trying to exhaust herself into something resembling peace. It didn't work. Her mind kept returning to the missions, replaying attack runs, second-guessing decisions, wondering if she could have been more efficient, more deadly, more useful. Around noon, she gave up and went to the flight line, found Tors working on her A-10, and spent 3 hours helping him with maintenance she was technically unqualified to perform. "You know you don't have to do this, ma'am," Tors said, watching her check hydraulic connections with surprising competence. "I know," Voss replied, "but I need to do something, and this is the closest I can get to flying without actually flying." Tors understood that. He'd worked with enough combat pilots to recognize the ones who needed the mission more than the mission needed them. They talked while they worked, not about combat or tactics, but about the aircraft itself, the systems and structures and engineering compromises that made the A-10 simultaneously outdated and irreplaceable. "They've been trying to retire this platform for 20 years, Tors said, his hands deep in an avionics bay. "Every time ground forces raise hell because nothing else does close air support like the Hog." Voss nodded. She'd heard all the arguments. Too slow, too vulnerable, couldn't survive modern air defenses. But none of those critics had ever been in a firebase under fire, watching an A-10 come through the smoke and chaos to pull them out. Speed and stealth were valuable. But sometimes, what you needed was an armored bathtub, with a massive gun that would stay overhead until the job was done. The public affairs captain found Voss in the maintenance hangar. His name was Thompson, and he approached with the careful courtesy of someone who'd been warned about the pilot's personality. "Captain Voss, I was hopping to ask you a few questions for an article we're preparing about close air support in Regional Command South." Voss continued checking her torque wrench settings. "I don't do interviews, Captain Thompson." He'd expected that response. "I understand. But the ground commanders we've spoken with have specifically requested that your contributions be recognized. Lieutenant Webb from the SEALs, Captain Mitchell from the Marines, Lieutenant Shaw from the Rangers. They're all telling the same story." Voss looked up from her work, meeting Thompson's eyes with an intensity that made him want to step backward. "What story is that?" Thompson chose his words carefully. "That there's a pilot who flies like her life doesn't matter as long as she completes the mission, who takes risks that terrify other aviators, who has personally saved dozens, maybe hundreds of American lives through sustained combat excellence." He paused. "They're calling you a legend, Captain, whether you want that or not." "Legends are for people who died doing something impressive," Voss said flatly. "I'm just a pilot doing my job." She returned to her work, the conversation clearly over. Thompson stood there for a moment longer, recognizing that he wasn't going to get the human interest story he'd hoped for. But as he walked away, he understood something about Captain Natalia Voss that would eventually make it into his article anyway. That she was the kind of person who'd survived her own death years ago and was now spending her time keeping others from having to do the same. Evening came with its usual dusty sunset. Voss ate in the dining facility, sitting alone with a book she wasn't really reading, watching the young soldiers and airmen around her joke and laugh and pretend they weren't in a war zone. Their youth struck her sometimes, how many of them were barely old enough to drink legally back home, yet here they were carrying weapons and making life-and-death decisions. She'd been that young once, fresh out of flight school, certain that her competence and dedication would be enough to solve any problem. Then life had taught her different. Her second deployment was tomorrow. Voss allowed herself a small moment of relief at the prospect of returning to flight status, then felt guilty about that relief. Needing combat missions wasn't healthy. She knew that. The psychologists would have a field day with her psychological profile if she ever let them conduct a proper evaluation. But health was relative. If flying kept her functional and kept other people alive, maybe that was the best outcome anyone could hope for under the circumstances. The mission brief the next morning detailed an operation near Marja, Marines pushing into a Taliban-controlled district, expected to meet heavy resistance. Multiple aircraft assigned. Voss would be part of a two-ship A-10 formation, wingman flying with a captain named Rivera who was on his first deployment. Rivera was competent by the book, flew exactly like they taught at the schoolhouse, which meant he'd be fine in routine situations and probably get someone killed the first time things went sideways. Voss had lobbied to fly single ship but been overruled. Policy now mandated 2 aircraft minimum for high-threat areas. "Just stay on my wing and follow my lead," Voss told Rivera during their brief. "When I tell you to break off, you break off. When I tell you to stay high, you stay high." "Clear," Rivera nodded, slightly intimidated. He'd heard the stories about Jester. Everyone had. Flying as her wingman was either going to be the best learning experience of his career or the most terrifying morning of his life. Possibly both. They launched at dawn, 2 gray sharks climbing into the pale sky, formation tucked tight. Rivera worked to stay in position, matching Voss's every movement, feeling the discipline required to fly formation in combat. It was different than training, the weight of knowing that mistakes here had consequences measured in lives rather than grade points. Voss led them toward the target area at 12,000 feet, high enough to be safe from most ground fire, low enough to respond quickly when called. The radio came alive with the controlled chaos of a ground offensive in progress. Multiple units reporting contact, enemy fighters defending prepared positions, casualty reports coming in. The Marines were taking a beating trying to push through, and they needed air support now. Jester Flight Nightmare 52 requesting immediate close air support, coordinates transmitted. A JTAC called, voice tight but professional. Voss acknowledged and led Rivera into a descent, dropping through 10,000, 8,000, 6,000 feet toward the fight. As she approached the target area, Voss could see the distinctive signs of a major firefight: smoke, tracers, the dust kicked up by explosions and movement. The Marines were pinned at an intersection, unable to advance or withdraw, taking fire from fortified buildings on 3 sides. This was going to be complex. Multiple targets, danger close restrictions, friendly forces mixed with enemy positions. The kind of mission where precision mattered and mistakes killed your own people. "Jester 2, hold high and cover," Voss transmitted to Rivera. "I'm going in for gun runs." Rivera acknowledged, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. He wanted to be part of the action, prove himself in combat. But Voss knew that danger-close work required experience and instincts that couldn't be taught in training. Better to keep him safe and effective in a support role than risk him making a fatal error under pressure. She rolled into her attack alone. The first building was a 3-story structure with enemy fighters firing from multiple windows. Voss came in from the north, nose down at a 30-degree angle, speed controlled, targeting Pipper steady on the middle floor. The GAU-8 spoke its familiar language. 30mm rounds tore through concrete and wood and flesh without discrimination. The building seemed to shudder under the impact. When Voss pulled off, smoke was pouring from the windows and the enemy fire had stopped. "Outstanding hits," the JTAC called. "Jester, second target is the blue 2-story northwest of the intersection. Danger close, friendlies approximately 300 meters south." Voss was already lining up the next run. 300 meters. That was right at the edge of what safety regulations allowed. She'd been closer. She came in from the west this time, adjusting for the friendly's position, putting her angle of attack perpendicular to their location. The cannon shells walked through the target building with mechanical precision. More smoke, more silence. For 90 minutes, Voss worked the target area methodically, eliminating threats one by one while Rivera maintained high cover and provided situational awareness. She burned through 2,000 rounds of ammunition, turning enemy strongpoints into smoking ruins, allowing the Marines to advance block by block through the district. This was what the A-10 was built for: sustained close air support, loitering over the battlefield, providing continuous fires while ground forces maneuvered. It wasn't glamorous. It was brutal, grinding work, but it saved lives. When she finally climbed off target, fuel reaching minimum reserves, the JTAC's voice came through with genuine warmth. "Jester Flight Nightmare 52, I don't know how to properly thank you. You just saved a lot of Marines today. Whatever they're paying you, it's not enough." Voss felt nothing particular about the praise. Just doing the job, nightmare. Gestures off. She headed home with Rivera tucked on her wing, the younger pilot stunned into silence by what he'd just witnessed. The brief was brief. Voss walked through her timeline, marked targets on the map, assessed enemy tactics and capabilities. Rivera sat quietly, absorbing lessons he hadn't known existed. When they finished, he caught up with Voss outside the operations center. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say that was the most incredible display of airmanship I've ever seen. The way you handled those danger-close situations." He trailed off, struggling for words. Voss regarded him with something that might have been sympathy. "Captain Rivera, I've been flying combat missions since before you were born. That's not boasting. That's just time and repetition. You keep flying, keep learning, stay humble, and eventually you'll develop those same instincts." She paused, considering whether to say more. "But here's what they don't teach at the schoolhouse. The mission matters more than you do. More than your career, your safety, your ego. Those Marines were counting on us. Everything else is secondary to that." Rivera absorbed this quietly. It was the longest personal conversation anyone reported Voss having with another pilot. "How do you do it, ma'am? How do you fly like that day after day without it destroying you?" Voss looked past him toward the flight line, where Torres and his crew were already servicing her A-10 for tomorrow's missions. "Who says it doesn't?" she replied, then walked away before Rivera could respond. The question would haunt him for the rest of his career. The days blended together in the particular way they did during combat deployments. Launch, fight, return, debrief, rest poorly, repeat. Voss flew through October and into November, accumulating mission after mission, protecting ground forces through the steady grind of counterinsurgency operations. The war was winding down according to politicians and strategists, but nobody had told the enemy that. The fighting continued with undiminished intensity, and American forces continued dying despite the best efforts of air support and superior firepower and technological advantage. Word continued to spread about the A-10 pilot with the old call sign who flew like death owed her money. Ground commanders began specifically requesting Jester for their operations. Some staff officers grumbled about personality cults and undue influence, but the results were impossible to argue with. Units supported by Voss had lower casualty rates. Missions she covered succeeded more often. The numbers told their own story, clinical and undeniable. Major General Kessler, still monitoring the situation from his headquarters, made a decision. He submitted paperwork upgrading Voss's Distinguished Flying Cross to a Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor in combat. The citation described sustained combat excellence across dozens of missions, extraordinary heroism under fire, and actions that had directly saved hundreds of American lives. It was approved rapidly, moving through channels with unusual speed. Someone high up in the chain of command wanted Voss recognized before something happened to make recognition posthumous. The award ceremony was scheduled for December 5th at Bagram. Voss tried to decline, claiming operational necessity, but was overruled. The ceremony would be small, just her squadron and some senior officers. No press, no publicity, just the formal recognition that the military used to acknowledge extraordinary service. Voss hated everything about the prospect but knew better than to continue fighting orders. She'd show up, accept the medal, return to flying. That was the path of least resistance. December 5th arrived cold and clear. Voss wore her dress uniform for the first time in months, feeling awkward and constrained compared to her flight suit. The uniform was correct, every ribbon and badge in perfect placement, but it felt like a costume. She wasn't a dress uniform officer. She was a pilot. The distinction mattered to her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Richards walked her to the ceremony, making small talk she barely heard, giving her the companionable silence she needed more than conversation. The assembled personnel stood at attention when Kessler entered. He was a tall man who carried his authority naturally, without the performative toughness some generals affected. He approached Voss, regarded her with the same calculating gaze from their previous meeting, then spoke loudly enough for everyone present to hear. Captain Natalia Voss has demonstrated sustained extraordinary heroism in aerial combat over a period of 7 months. Her actions have directly resulted in the successful completion of 38 high-risk missions and the preservation of hundreds of American lives. Her courage, skill, and dedication to duty represent the highest traditions of military service. He pinned the silver star to Voss's uniform, the small silver medallion weighing almost nothing physically but carrying the weight of recognition and expectation. Voss saluted crisply, thanked the general with appropriate formality, and stood while people applauded. She felt disconnected from the moment, like she was watching someone else receive the award. These ceremonies were for heroes, and she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a mother who'd failed to save her child, and was now spending her remaining years trying to save other people's children as inadequate compensation. After the ceremony, people approached to offer congratulations. Squadron mates, maintainers, even some ground forces who'd been at Bagram and heard about the event. Voss accepted their words with polite distance, counting the minutes until she could escape back to her quarters. Then she saw Webb, Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the SEAL team she'd saved 7 months ago. He'd come specifically for this ceremony, traveled from his forward base to Bagram just to be present. "Captain Voss," Webb said, offering his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally. My entire team is alive because of what you did. We'll never forget that." Voss shook his hand, seeing in his eyes the particular look that combat veterans shared, the recognition of someone who'd walked close to death and come back. "You did your job on the ground. I did mine from the air. That's how it works." Webb smiled slightly. "Ma'am, what you did was well beyond duty. You pressed attacks that most pilots wouldn't attempt. You stayed on station when others would have bugged out. You're the reason 12 men made it home to their families." Voss had no response to that. Families. Home. The words felt foreign in her mouth. She nodded acknowledgement and extracted herself from the conversation as politely as possible. Later, alone in her quarters, she looked at the silver star lying on her desk and felt absolutely nothing about it. Another piece of metal for another drawer. Another obligation fulfilled without satisfaction or pride. She'd done her job. The only payment that mattered was the continued survival of the people she'd protected. Everything else was noise. The deployment ended 2 weeks later. Voss rotated back to stateside, returning to a world that felt increasingly alien with each passing year. She had a small house near the base, a place she maintained but didn't really inhabit. The rooms were clean and spare, filled with furniture that served function rather than comfort. She had no pets, no plants, nothing that required care or attention when she was deployed, which was most of the time. She preferred it that way. At home, the silence was absolute and crushing. No aircraft engines, no radio chatter, no purpose beyond existing until the next deployment cycle. Voss tried to maintain routine, running, gym work, reading technical manuals, but everything felt hollow compared to combat operations. She understood that this was unhealthy, that she was using deployment as an escape from life rather than living actual life. But understanding didn't change the fundamental truth that she felt more alive at 52 in a combat zone than she did in peacetime America. The photos of Alina were still on her walls, tracking her daughter's progression from infant to the 7-year-old frozen in time. Voss had stopped adding pictures after the diagnosis, as if she could preserve Alina forever at her most vibrant moment. Sometimes she talked to the photographs, telling her daughter about missions and close calls and the people she'd protected. It was probably crazy, probably unhealthy, but it was the only conversation that felt real anymore. 3 months passed in the gray zone between deployments. Voss attended mandatory training, filled out paperwork, avoided social gatherings, and counted days until she could return to flying combat missions. Her squadron commander called her in for a counseling session that was really a wellness check disguised as administrative review. "Captain, I'm concerned about your work-life balance," the colonel said carefully. "You've been deployed for 68 of the last 96 months. That's not sustainable. You need to take time for yourself, Heal, process. Voss regarded him with the flat expression that had become her response to concern. Sir, I appreciate your attention to my well-being, but I'm healthy, I'm effective, and I'm mission qualified. If you need me to take leave, I'll take leave, but I'll be volunteering for the next deployment cycle regardless. The colonel sighed. He'd expected that response. Captain, at some point you're going to have to confront whatever you're running from. The military can't be your entire life. Voss almost laughed at that. Almost. With respect, sir, the military has been my life since I was 22 years old. It's the only thing I know how to do. The next deployment cycle came faster than expected. Taliban forces, sensing the final American withdrawal approaching, had intensified operations across Afghanistan. The demand for close air support exceeded available assets. Voss volunteered immediately and was accepted without hesitation. She packed her gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times, said goodbye to no one because there was no one to say goodbye to, and deployed back to Bagram in early spring. The reunion with her aircraft felt like coming home in a way that her actual house never did. Tors had kept the A-10 in perfect condition during her absence, treating the machine with the reverence it deserved. "Welcome back, ma'am," he said, grinning. "She missed you." Voss ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the patches and repairs that marked previous damage, the history of combat written in rivets and replaced panels. "I missed her too," she admitted, which was probably the most honest emotional statement she'd made in months. The operation's tempo was even higher than her previous deployment. Voss flew almost daily, sometimes multiple sorties when aircraft availability and pilot rest requirements aligned. She fell back into the rhythm of combat operations like she'd never left: brief, fly, fight, return, debrief, rest poorly, repeat. The missions blurred together, each one both unique and identical. Different valley, different enemy position, different Americans needing protection. But always the same fundamental task: find threats, eliminate threats, keep people alive until they could go home. In May, during a mission near Kandahar, everything nearly ended. Voss was working close air support for an army unit pinned by a larger enemy force. She'd made 3 gun runs, eliminating multiple targets when she felt the impact. Not dramatic, just a sharp bang and a red warning light on her panel. Small arms fire had found something important: hydraulic system showing depressurization, flight controls getting sluggish. The A-10 could fly with extensive damage, but there were limits even to its legendary toughness. "Nightmare jesters taking hits," Voss transmitted, her voice calm despite the situation. "Hydraulics failing, breaking off attack." She pointed her nose toward Bagram, adding power, nursing the damaged aircraft through the sky. The controls were getting worse, requiring more stick force to maintain level flight. Tors was going to be upset about this. She was upset about it, not because of danger to herself that barely registered, but because she was leaving the ground forces unsupported. Another aircraft would respond, but there'd be a gap, and in that gap Americans might die. She made it back to base on what Tors would later describe as sheer stubbornness and supernatural luck. The landing was rough, the aircraft barely responding to control inputs, but she got it on the runway without crashing. Fire crews met her as she taxied off, foam at the ready, preparing for the worst. Tors ran to the aircraft before she'd fully shut down, eyes wide with concern. "Ma'am, you should have ejected. The hydraulics were almost completely gone." Voss climbed down slowly, her legs shaking slightly from adrenaline or age or both. "The aircraft was still flyable," she said simply. "No point in ejecting if you can make it home." Tors wanted to argue but knew it was pointless. This was who she was, someone who'd coax a dying aircraft back to base because ejecting meant losing the plane, and losing the plane meant one less asset available for the mission. Her priorities were absolutely clear, even if they were potentially suicidal. The damage assessment showed that she'd been lucky. A few inches different and the rounds would have severed critical hydraulic lines completely. She would have lost control and either ejected over hostile territory or augured into the ground. Instead, she'd limped home and the aircraft could be repaired. Torres worked for 3 days straight to get it mission-ready again. When he finished, he found Voss on the flight line, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Aircraft's ready, ma'am," Torres said quietly. "But I need to say something. You're taking risks that scare me. I've been working on combat aircraft for 12 years and I've never seen a pilot push like you do. It's going to catch up eventually." Voss didn't look at him, kept her eyes on the mountains where the light was fading. "Everyone dies eventually, Sergeant Torres. The only question is whether it means something when it happens. If I die keeping someone else's daughter alive, that's meaning enough for me." Torres had no response to that. What could you say to someone who'd already lost everything that mattered and was now spending their remaining time trying to balance accounts with an uncaring universe? He walked away feeling helpless and angry at a military system that would use someone like Voss until she broke completely. But he kept her aircraft flying, because that's what crew chiefs did. They maintained the machines that kept the pilots alive, and they didn't ask questions about why some pilots seemed determined to test those machines' limits. June arrived with its crushing heat. Voss flew through it, ignoring temperatures that made the cockpit feel like a convection oven, pressing missions in conditions that had other pilots making excuses to stay on the ground. Her squadron commander finally put his foot down, mandating she take 3 consecutive days off. No flying, no maintenance work, actual rest. Voss complied under protest, spending the enforced downtime in her quarters staring at ceiling and waiting for it to be over. On the second day, Webb found her. The SEAL lieutenant had rotated back to Afghanistan and was stationed at Bagram temporarily. He'd heard Voss was grounded and came looking for her in the dining facility. "Captain Voss, permission to join you?" Webb asked, gesturing to the empty seats at her table. Voss shrugged, which Webb took as assent. He sat down with his meal and ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before speaking. "I've been telling people your story," Webb said finally. "What you did for my team, what you've done for dozens of other teams. You're becoming legendary among the ground forces, you know. They call you the Guardian." Voss looked up from her untouched food. "That's ridiculous. I'm just a pilot doing my job." Webb shook his head. "With respect, ma'am, it's more than that. You fly missions that most pilots avoid. You take risks that regulations specifically prohibit. You've saved more American lives than probably anyone in this theater. That's not just doing your job. That's something else." Voss was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that Webb had to lean in to hear. "My daughter died when she was 7, cancer. I was a pilot then too, deployed when she was diagnosed. I got emergency leave, came home, watched her suffer for 11 months before she died. I wasn't there at the end. Fell asleep in the chair next to her bed and woke up and she was gone." She paused, her hands gripping her fork too tightly. "So no, Lieutenant, I'm not a guardian. I'm just a mother who failed at the most important job she ever had, and I'm trying very hard to make sure other people's children get to grow up." Webb felt like he'd been punched. The raw pain in those words, delivered so matter-of-factly, showed him depths of grief he couldn't begin to understand. "Captain, you can't save everyone, you know that, right? Eventually you're going to have to forgive yourself." Voss stood up, her meal still untouched. "I can't forgive myself, but I can keep flying, that's all I have." She left before Webb could respond, walking back to her quarters through the dusty afternoon heat, carrying her guilt like a second skin. Webb told that story too, though more carefully, more quietly. Word spread through the close-knit community of Special Operations Forces about the pilot carrying unimaginable grief, converting it into action that saved lives. The story changed how people thought about Jester 2-1. She wasn't just competent or brave or even legendary. She was human, broken in fundamental ways, and still showing up every day to do the hardest job in the inventory. That kind of courage had a different quality than the Hollywood version. It was grimmer, more desperate, infinitely more real. The third day of her enforced rest, Voss received a message through official channels. She was being promoted to major. The promotion had been delayed for years due to her refusal to pursue career-enhancing assignments, her avoidance of political maneuvering, her single-minded focus on flying combat missions. But sustained combat excellence had its own logic. You couldn't ignore results forever. The promotion ceremony would be held at Bagram in 2 weeks. Voss felt nothing about the rank. It meant more pay, slightly more authority, expectations of taking on staff positions that would keep her out of the cockpit. She'd accept the promotion because refusing would create problems, but she'd fight tooth and nail against any attempt to ground her. The Air Force needed combat pilots more than it needed staff officers, and she'd argue that position until they either agreed or forced her into retirement. Either outcome was acceptable. As long as she could fly, nothing else mattered. The promotion ceremony was smaller than the Silver Star event. Just her squadron, Richards pinning on the new rank, brief congratulations and handshakes. Major Natalia Voss. It had a different sound than captain, but it didn't change who she was or what she did. She thanked Richards appropriately, posed for an official photograph that would go in her service record, then immediately filed her flight schedule for the next day. Back to work. Back to the only thing that made sense. That summer became the stuff of legend. Voss flew 93 combat missions between June and September, an almost unprecedented number for a single pilot. She covered operations across southern Afghanistan, working with Marines, Army, Rangers, SEALs, anyone who needed close air support. Her combat effectiveness ratings remained perfect. Her aircraft accumulation of battle damage was notable but never fatal. And slowly, incrementally, the respect she'd earned from ground forces began spreading to the wider Air Force community. Fighter pilots, traditionally dismissive of the A-10 and its unglamorous mission, started acknowledging that something extraordinary was happening. A pilot was executing sustained combat operations at a level that exceeded normal capability. The tactics she employed, the risks she accepted, the results she produced, all of it suggested either complete recklessness or transcendent skill. Most observers eventually concluded it was both, mixed in proportions that defied analysis. The Air Force magazine did a profile piece in August, carefully written to respect Voss's privacy while acknowledging her combat record. They called her the most effective close air support pilot in current operations, and detailed her statistical achievements: missions flown, ordnance delivered, troops protected, enemy positions eliminated. The article mentioned her Silver Star, her promotion, her 27 years of service. It did not mention Alina. Voss had made that condition clear when grudgingly agreeing to the interview. Her daughter's death was not material for propaganda or publicity. In September, the withdrawal timeline accelerated. American forces began consolidating, closing forward bases, pulling back toward major installations. The enemy pressed their advantages everywhere, sensing weakness, seeking to claim victory before the last Americans departed. The fighting intensified to levels not seen since the initial invasion years before, and Voss flew through all of it, providing the close air support that allowed ground forces to withdraw without being overrun. Her final mission of that deployment came on September 27th. A Marine battalion was conducting a retrograde operation near Helmand, pulling back from an isolated base with all their equipment and personnel. The Taliban saw opportunity and attacked in force, trying to cut off the withdrawal route and trap the Marines in a kill zone. Multiple aircraft responded: fast movers, helicopters, and Voss in her A-10. She was first on station and last to leave, spending 7 hours overhead, cycling through weapons, coordinating with other aircraft, providing the continuous coverage that allowed the Marines to extract successfully. When she landed at Bagram that evening, fuel gauge reading empty, ammunition completely expended, Torres met her with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, I just got word. This is your last mission. You're rotating stateside tomorrow. Deployment's over." Voss climbed out of the cockpit slowly, every joint aching, every muscle burning. "Already?" she asked, though she'd known the timeline. Torres nodded. "Yes, ma'am. 118 combat missions this deployment. Nobody else even comes close." Voss looked at her aircraft, scarred and patched and still flying. "Take care of her while I'm gone," she said simply, then walked away before Torres could see how close she was to breaking down. The flight home was long and uncomfortable and filled with soldiers and airmen who'd survived another deployment. They laughed and joked and made plans for leave time with their families. Voss sat alone, reading a book she wasn't processing, thinking about nothing in particular because thinking about the future was pointless and thinking about the past was agony. She'd go home, maintain her empty house, wait for the next deployment cycle. That was all there was. But something had shifted during this rotation. Word about Voss had reached very senior levels, general officers at the Pentagon, staff in Air Combat Command, people who made decisions about force structure and capabilities. They'd seen her statistics, read the ground commander testimonials, understood that they had a pilot performing at historic levels of effectiveness, and they began discussing how to use that capability more broadly. Major General Patterson, commander of Air Combat Command's Warfare Center, made a proposal. Bring Voss back to the States. Have her work with the weapons school, training the next generation of A-10 pilots. Use her experience and combat wisdom to improve the entire community's effectiveness. Patterson submitted his recommendation up the chain, where it was endorsed by the commander of Air Combat Command and forwarded to Air Force Headquarters. Voss knew none of this. She returned to her empty house, resumed her routine of running and gym work in silence. She checked in with her squadron, confirmed she was available for immediate redeployment, and settled in to wait. The orders came 6 weeks later, but they weren't deployment orders. They were reassignment orders. She was being transferred to Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, to serve as a senior instructor at the USAF Weapons School, effective immediately, non-negotiable. Voss read the orders 3 times, feeling something close to panic rising in her chest. Instructor duty. The career kiss of death for someone who wanted to keep flying combat missions. She'd be teaching theoretical scenarios to students who'd never heard shots fired in anger, wasting her time on classroom presentations when she could be overseas protecting actual Americans in actual danger. This was everything she'd been avoiding for 27 years. She called Richards, who'd been expecting her reaction. Major Voss, I know you're upset, but this is a huge honor. The weapons school is the pinnacle of tactical aviation training. They specifically requested you based on your combat record. Voss cut him off. Sir, I don't care about honor or prestige. I care about flying combat missions. Can I refuse the orders? Richards sighed. No, you can't refuse. You can request a review, but that will take months and the answer will still be no. They want you at Nellis, and that's where you're going. Voss hung up and sat in her empty house feeling like the walls were closing in. Teaching, schoolhouse, safety and comfort, and people who played at war without understanding its cost. She'd suffocate. She'd go insane. She stopped herself. This was the military. Orders were orders. You followed them even when they destroyed you. She'd report to Nellis, do the job, and hope that eventually she could maneuver back into deployable status. It was the only path forward. Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, home of the Air Force's most elite training programs. Voss arrived in December to a world utterly different from Afghanistan. No mortars, no dust, no one actively trying to kill her. Just pristine facilities, motivated students, and the carefully controlled simulation of combat that would never capture its actual terror and chaos. She met her new commander, Colonel Hayes, a former F-15 pilot who transitioned to staff work and seemed genuinely excited to have her on his team. Major Voss, your combat record speaks for itself, Hayes said during their initial meeting. We're honored to have you joining our instructor cadre. Your experience will be invaluable to our students. Voss nodded politely, thinking that experience couldn't be taught in classroom, that you either learned combat wisdom by surviving it or you didn't learn it at all. But she kept those thoughts private. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. Hayes smiled. I know you will. You've never done anything less. The curriculum surprised her. It wasn't the theoretical nonsense she'd feared. The weapons school took training seriously, running students through realistic scenarios with real consequences for failure. The academic portion was intense, covering tactics and weapons employment and threat analysis in exhaustive detail. But the flying portion was where the program earned its reputation. Students flew against adversary aircraft, simulated surface-to-air threats, and combined arms exercises that tested their ability to think and adapt under pressure. Voss was assigned to the A-10 division, teaching close air support and combat search and rescue tactics. Her first class of students were all combat experienced, majors and captains who deployed multiple times but wanted to refine their skills to instructor level. They approached her with mixture of respect and curiosity, aware of her reputation, but unsure what to expect from someone who'd spent recent years in combat rather than schoolhouse environment. "I'm Major Voss," she told them on the first day. "I've been flying the A-10 for 27 years. I've flown over 600 combat missions across 4 wars. I don't care about your rank, your background, or who you know. I care about whether you can fly close air support without killing friendlies and whether you can survive to fly again tomorrow. That's all." It was blunt to the point of rudeness, but it set the tone. This wasn't going to be gentle instruction. This was going to be the real thing, taught by someone who'd seen what happened when pilots made mistakes. The first academic session covered danger-close weapons employment. Voss taught from experience rather than doctrine, describing actual scenarios she'd flown, explaining the geometry and calculations and split-second decisions required when American lives depended on precision. The students listened with intensity rare in classroom settings, recognizing that they were hearing hard-won wisdom that couldn't be found in textbooks. One captain raised his hand. "Ma'am, I've read the regulations on danger-close employment. They recommend maintaining 500 meters separation from friendly forces, but you've filed mission reports describing gun runs at 300 meters. How do you justify that?" Voss looked at him with the flat expression that had become her default when dealing with by-the-book thinking. "Captain, regulations are written for average pilots in average situations. When you're overhead and Americans are dying, you don't think about regulations. You think about whether you can make the shot without hitting friendlies. If you can, you take it. If you can't, you find another approach. The only unacceptable outcome is letting those Americans die because you were worried about paperwork." The class absorbed that quietly. It was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, permission to break rules when the mission demanded it, with the understanding that consequences fell on the pilot making that decision. This was not the safe, approved solution instruction they'd expected. This was combat wisdom from someone who'd survived by trusting capability over comfort. The flying portion started the next week. Voss flew with each student individually, evaluating their skills, identifying weaknesses, pushing them past their comfort zones. She was demanding in ways that made previous instructors seem gentle. She'd put students in impossible scenarios: low fuel, weapons malfunctions, bad weather, ticks in multiple locations simultaneously, and force them to prioritize and adapt. Students who tried to follow rigid procedures found themselves failing spectacularly. Students who learned to think and improvise started succeeding. Captain Marsh, a cocky former F-16 pilot who transitioned to the A-10, learned his lesson the hard way. During a simulated mission, Voss gave him a scenario where ground forces were taking casualties and needed immediate support. Marsh flew a textbook approach, following all procedures, making all proper radio calls, and in the process wasted 3 minutes that would have cost American lives in actual combat. Voss terminated the exercise and brought him back to base in silence. The debrief was brutal. "Captain Marsh, what did you just do wrong?" Voss asked. Marsh looked confused. "Ma'am, I followed all proper procedures. 9-line brief, weapons checklist cleared hot by the JTAC." Voss cut him off. "You followed procedures while Americans died. I gave you a scenario with wounded soldiers and enemy forces 50 meters away. You had the position, you had ordnance, and you wasted time on checklist items instead of killing the threat. In actual combat, that hesitation costs lives. You need to learn when to cut corners and when to follow procedure. That's the difference between competent and excellent." Marsh absorbed the criticism with difficulty. He'd been top of his class in previous assignments, praised for his by-the-book flying. Now this combat-scarred major was telling him that everything he'd learned was wrong. Or not wrong, exactly, just insufficient for the reality of war. It was a hard lesson, but it was the right lesson. Over the following weeks, Marsh learned to balance procedure with pragmatism, to recognize when speed mattered more than perfection. He became a better pilot for it. Voss taught through the spring and into summer, running multiple classes through the intense weapons school syllabus. Her reputation grew among students, demanding but fair, harsh but honest, someone who cared deeply about preparing them for the reality of combat rather than the theory of it. She didn't socialize with other instructors, didn't attend the social events that were traditional part of weapons school culture. She taught, flew, went home to her off-base apartment. The pattern was sustainable because it was all she had. In June, Colonel Hayes called her to his office. "Major Voss, I've received some interesting communication from Air Force headquarters. They're asking about your availability for a potential assignment to Afghanistan again. Seems the ground commanders there have been requesting you specifically for an upcoming operation." Voss felt her pulse quicken for the first time in months. "Sir, I'm available immediately." Hayes smiled slightly. "I thought you might say that, but there's a complication. You're midway through training your current class. They need 6 more weeks to complete the syllabus." Voss forced herself to think rationally rather than emotionally. Her students needed the full training cycle. Half-trained pilots were dangerous to themselves and others, but 6 weeks felt like eternity when there was possibility of returning to combat operations. "Sir, can I recommend alternatives? Captain Marsh is ready to step into instructor role. He could handle the remaining academic portions while I'm deployed." Hayes considered this. "That's irregular, but not impossible. Let me see what I can arrange." 3 days later, Voss had her orders. Temporary duty assignment to Afghanistan for 60 days, supporting a large-scale operation near Kandahar. She'd leave in 1 week. Her students threw her an impromptu going-away gathering, which Voss attended briefly out of obligation but left as soon as politely possible. They understood. Their instructor was going back to war, to the place where her skills actually mattered, where she could do the job she'd been born to do. The schoolhouse had been prison sentence she'd endured with grace. Now she was being released back to meaningful work. The return to Afghanistan felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 6 months. Voss arrived at Kandahar Airfield in July to familiar heat and dust and purpose. Her A-10 was waiting, not the same tail number she'd flown before, but the same design, same capabilities, same reliable ugliness that promised survival over beauty. Torres wasn't there. He'd rotated to a different unit, but the new crew chief, a technical sergeant named Kim, had heard all about her and was determined to keep her aircraft mission ready. "Ma'am, I've been reading your mission history," Kim said while they walked around the aircraft. "I have to say, some of the damage reports made me worried for anyone who flies with you." Voss allowed herself a small smile. "Sergeant Kim, the aircraft took that damage so I didn't have to. That's the whole point of the titanium bathtub. It absorbs punishment that would kill pilots in prettier aircraft." Kim nodded slowly. "Well, ma'am, I promise this bird will be ready whenever you need her. Already did a complete systems check. She's perfect." The mission brief outlined a major operation, coalition forces pushing Taliban elements out of a series of villages near Kandahar. Large scale, multiple units involved, significant air support assigned. Voss would be part of an A-10 package providing close air support for the ground elements. The operation was expected to last several weeks, with sustained combat probable. Exactly the kind of mission that validated her entire career, protecting ground forces through extended combat operations, using her aircraft's endurance and firepower to maximum advantage. She flew the first mission at dawn, part of a 4-ship formation working with different ground elements. The coordination was complex, multiple JTACs, various units with different needs, threats emerging unpredictably as the ground forces advanced. Voss worked the radio with practiced efficiency, staying aware of the overall battle while focusing on her assigned sector. When her JTAC called for support, She was already positioning for the attack, reading the situation, calculating approaches that would maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk to friendly forces. The Taliban fought harder than expected. They'd had time to prepare defensive positions, dig in heavy weapons, pre-position fighters in buildings and tree lines. The coalition advanced ground forward through sustained contact, taking casualties, calling for air support continuously. Voss spent 5 hours overhead that first day, expending all her ordnance, watching ground forces slowly clear each objective through fire and maneuver. It was grinding, exhausting work, both for the troops on the ground and the pilots supporting them from above. By the end of the first week, Voss had flown 11 missions. She fell back into the combat rhythm like she'd never left, her body remembering the physical demands even as her mind appreciated the clarity of purpose. This was where she belonged, not in classroom teaching theory, but overhead protecting people who needed protection. The knowledge that she was making tangible difference, that her actions directly corresponded to saved lives, was the only thing that made sense in a world that had lost all other meaning. The operation continued through July and into August. Voss flew almost daily, sometimes twice when operational demands required it. She worked with Rangers, SEALs, conventional infantry, Marines, every flavor of ground combat force in theater. And consistently, the feedback was the same: exceptional support, surgical precision, absolute commitment to mission completion. Her call sign was becoming known throughout regional command south as the pilot everyone wanted overhead when things got bad. Mid-August brought the mission that would become the defining moment of her career, the one that would finally transform her from respected combat pilot to genuine legend. A ranger company was conducting an operation in the mountains north of Kandahar when intelligence failed catastrophically. Instead of the estimated 50 Taliban fighters they expected, the Rangers walked into a prepared kill zone with over 300 enemy combatants dug in and waiting. The ambush was devastating. Within minutes, the Rangers had multiple casualties and were pinned in a valley with no good options for withdrawal. Enemy fire was coming from elevated positions on 3 sides, the classic L-shaped ambush that military tacticians dreaded. The company commander called for immediate close air support with the kind of desperation that indicated he understood his force might be annihilated without intervention. Every available aircraft scrambled. Voss was first to respond, airborne within 12 minutes of the initial contact. She arrived overhead to chaos. Radio traffic was compressed and urgent, multiple people trying to coordinate while under fire. Voss cut through the noise with calm authority. All stations, Jester 2-1 on station with full combat load. Ground commander, authenticate and pass situation. The Ranger captain, his name was Foster, responded with barely controlled panic in his voice. Jester, we're surrounded, taking effective fire from elevated positions at grid November Victor 427936. We've got 6 casualties who need immediate extract, but we can't get to the extract point. Enemy positions are too well defended. Voss studied the terrain through her sensors and visual observation. The Rangers were trapped in a valley bottom with steep ridges on 3 sides. Enemy positions dotted those ridges, protected by rocks and terrain features that made them difficult targets. A traditional airstrike would be risky. Precision weapons could hit some positions, but others were too close to the Rangers for safe employment. This was going to require gun work, danger close, in terrain that made gun runs difficult and dangerous. Ground commander, acknowledge you have friendlies marked with V-17 panels, Voss transmitted, already calculating attack angles. Jester will engage targets on Western Ridge first. Expect gun runs from south to north. Keep your people down. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, already rolling into her first attack. The Western Ridge was the immediate threat, heavy machine guns that were tearing through the Rangers' thin cover. She lined up perpendicular to the ridge line, minimizing her exposure to ground fire while maximizing her angle on the targets. The GAU-8 roared. 30mm rounds walked along the western ridge, eliminating positions with brutal efficiency. Voss pulled off hard, gaining altitude while watching for enemy fire from other positions. She'd gotten their attention. Multiple enemy fighters shifted their aim from the Rangers to her aircraft, tracers arcing up through the morning sky. She ignored them, already setting up for her next pass. This was the part where courage met insanity, deliberately drawing fire to protect ground forces, trusting her aircraft's armor to absorb damage that would destroy lesser planes. Her second run targeted the northern positions. She came in lower this time, 3,000 feet above ground level, putting herself well within range of heavy machine guns. The GAU-8 spoke again. More positions eliminated. More enemy fighters killed or suppressed. But the aircraft shuddered under the impact of multiple rounds finding her wings and fuselage. Warning lights illuminated on her panel, hydraulic system depressurization, fuel leak in the left wing tank. She acknowledged the warnings without emotion, already climbing for her third pass. "Jester, you're trailing fuel," Foster transmitted, his voice tight with concern. "Are you okay up there?" Voss checked her gauges. The leak was significant but not immediately fatal. She had maybe 30 minutes before fuel state became critical. Plenty of time to complete the mission. "Solid copy, Ground Commander. Jester's continuing attacks. Prepare to move your casualties to extract point on my mark." She rolled into her third pass, targeting the eastern ridge positions that were still pouring fire into the Rangers' location. This time the enemy was ready for her. Heavy fire concentrated on her approach path, tracers converging where she'd have to fly. Voss adjusted her angle slightly, came in from offset position, and laid down another perfect gun run before pulling off in a climbing turn that stressed her damaged aircraft. More warning lights. Flight controls getting sluggish. The A-10 was taking damage that would have downed most aircraft, but it kept flying because that's what warthogs did. They absorbed punishment and kept their pilots alive long enough to complete the mission. "Ground Commander, execute your movement now," Voss transmitted. "I'm suppressing Eastern Ridge." She rolled back in for her fourth pass, this time firing long bursts that forced enemy fighters to take cover rather than shooting at the Rangers trying to reach their extract point. She could see them moving below, carrying wounded, providing covering fire for each other, executing the training that kept them alive in impossible situations. This was why she flew. These moments. These people. This absolute clarity of purpose. Her fifth pass took more damage. Larger caliber rounds, probably 14.7 heavy machine gun, punched through her left wing, shredding metal and systems. The aircraft yawed hard right, wanting to depart controlled flight. Voss fought it back to level with rudder and aileron, muscle memory, and thousands of hours of experience compensating for failing systems. "Jester's hit bad," she transmitted, her voice still calm despite flying an aircraft that was trying to kill her. "Going to make one more pass, then I'm off." Foster's voice came back desperate. "Jester, negative. Break off now. We can hold until other aircraft arrive." But Voss had already committed to her final attack. The eastern ridge still had active positions, and until those were suppressed, the Rangers couldn't complete their extract. She lined up one last time, ignoring the warning lights that now covered most of her panel, ignoring the smell of hydraulic fluid leaking into the cockpit, ignoring everything except the targets and the geometry and the moment of weapons release. The GAU-8 fired its last burst. She'd expended every round, emptied the magazine into enemy positions that had been trying to kill American soldiers. The eastern ridge fell silent. Voss pulled off, felt her aircraft shudder violently, and realized she'd lost both hydraulic systems completely. The A-10 had a manual reversion mode for flight controls, but it was difficult to fly and barely responsive. She pointed her nose toward Kandahar, 70 miles away, and began coaxing her dying aircraft toward home. "Jester, Nightmare 7-8, a new voice came through her headset. The airborne battlefield command and control aircraft had been monitoring the situation. "Be advised, We're showing you've lost hydraulics and have multiple leaks. Recommend you eject over friendly territory." Voss checked her position and fuel state. Possible she could make it back. Also possible the aircraft would fail catastrophically and she'd auger into the ground. The smart money said punch out and live to fly another day. But ejecting meant losing the aircraft. Meant one less A-10 available for the ground forces who needed them. Meant failing to bring the bird home, failing Tors and Kim and every crew chief who'd kept her flying through hundreds of missions. Negative on ejection, Voss transmitted. Jesters attempting recovery to Kandahar. The ABCC controller tried to argue, but she cut him off. This aircraft is still flying. That's all that matters. The flight back was nightmare exercise in aircraft control. Manual reversion meant every input required physical force, pushing control surfaces against airflow with pure muscle rather than hydraulic assistance. Her arms burned. Her hands cramped. Sweat poured down her face inside the oxygen mask. The aircraft wanted to depart controlled flight, wanted to roll inverted and plunge toward Earth. Voss fought it every second, making constant corrections, keeping wings level through sheer determination. Kandahar Tower cleared all traffic when they heard her situation. Fire trucks positioned along the runway, medical personnel standing by. Kim and a dozen other crew chiefs watched from the flight line, faces tight with worry. Voss lined up on final approach, the runway stretching ahead like salvation. Her airspeed was too high. She couldn't lower flaps without hydraulics, but she'd land hot and hope the brakes held. The ground rushed up. She pulled back on the stick with everything she had, trying to flare for landing. The A-10 touched down hard, main gear slamming onto concrete, the entire airframe groaning under the impact. Voss stood on the brakes, feeling them fade as hydraulic pressure bled away. She was going to run out of runway. The aircraft was barely slowing. 2,000 feet of concrete left, then 1,000, then 500. She pulled the emergency brake handle, felt the aircraft slow dramatically, and finally rolled to a stop with maybe 50 feet of runway remaining. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, adrenaline finally catching up to her. She'd nearly died, should have died. The aircraft around her was destroyed, dozens of holes punched through wings and fuselage, systems shredded, fuel leaking, hydraulic fluid coating everything. But she'd brought it home, completed the mission and saved the aircraft. Kim reached her cockpit first, climbing up with tears streaming down his face. "Ma'am, I can't believe you flew that home. That aircraft shouldn't be able to fly." Voss climbed out slowly, legs barely supporting her weight. "Sergeant Kim, she's tough, tougher than me. Can you fix her?" Kim looked at the damage and shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, this is going to take weeks, maybe months. Honestly, they might just scrap her and issue you a new bird." Voss felt something twist in her chest at that. This aircraft had kept her alive through the worst combat she'd ever experienced. It deserved better than the scrap heap. "Do what you can," she said quietly, then walked toward the debrief feeling like she'd aged a decade in 2 hours. The debrief lasted 3 hours. Voss walked through every detail of the mission, targets engaged, weapons employed, damage sustained, decisions made. The debrief officer, a lieutenant colonel named Walsh, kept stopping her to ask clarifying questions, particularly about the decision to continue attacking after taking significant damage. "Major Voss, at what point did you consider ejecting?" Walsh asked. Voss looked at him flatly. "Never. The mission wasn't complete. The Rangers needed support. Everything else was secondary." Walsh absorbed that quietly. He'd flown combat missions himself years ago, understood the psychology of pilots under fire. But Voss's decision-making went beyond normal combat calculus. She deliberately accepted risk that regulations and doctrine said was unacceptable. She'd chosen mission over personal safety in ways that were either extraordinarily brave or borderline suicidal. "Major, I need to be direct with you. Your actions today likely saved the entire Ranger Company. But they also nearly got you killed. That concerns me from a sustainability standpoint." Voss felt the familiar frustration rising. Everyone always concerned about sustainability, about managing risk, about preserving assets for future operations. Nobody seemed to understand that sometimes the mission demanded everything you had and sustainability didn't enter the equation. Sir, with respect, those Rangers are going home to their families because I stayed on station. That's the only sustainability metric that matters to me. Walsh had no response to that. He finished the debrief in silence and forwarded his report up the chain, with a recommendation that Voss be both decorated for valor and evaluated for fitness to continue flying combat operations. The story spread through Kandahar airfield within hours. The A-10 pilot who'd taken devastating damage but refused to quit, who'd kept pressing attacks until the ground forces were safe, who'd flown a crippled aircraft 70 miles back to base rather than ejecting. Pilots from other squadrons came by to see the damaged A-10, standing in stunned silence at the extent of destruction. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a shredder. That it had brought its pilot home was testament to both design excellence and pilot skill beyond normal capability. Foster's Rangers extracted successfully. All casualties survived to reach medical care. Foster submitted a statement through his chain of command that described Voss's actions in language usually reserved for Medal of Honor recommendations. This pilot deliberately exposed herself to enemy fire to protect my company. She continued attacking despite catastrophic damage to her aircraft. Her courage under fire directly resulted in the survival of 117 Rangers who would otherwise have been killed or captured. I cannot adequately express the debt we owe. The nomination for the Air Force Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor, one step below the Medal of Honor, was submitted within days. This time Voss couldn't deflect or downplay. The evidence was overwhelming. Extended combat against significant enemy force, multiple hits to aircraft, continued attacks despite damage, successful extraction of ground forces, miraculous recovery to base. The narrative was undeniable, and the Air Force needed hero stories as much as it needed actual heroes. The award process would take months to work through bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Voss was grounded pending aircraft availability and medical evaluation. The flight surgeon insisted on complete physical examination after what he described as sustained exposure to extreme operational stress. Voss submitted to the examination with poor grace, knowing that resistance would only extend her grounding. The results showed exactly what she expected: elevated stress hormones, signs of physical exhaustion, psychological indicators of sustained trauma exposure. The flight surgeon wanted to ground her for 30 days mandatory rest. Voss argued, she always argued, "Doc, I'm physically capable of flying. All my systems check out. You're grounding me based on numbers rather than actual capability." The surgeon, a major named Chen who'd seen enough broken pilots to recognize the pattern, shook his head. "Major Voss, those numbers indicate you're running on reserves that are almost depleted. You need rest, real rest. Not sitting around waiting to fly again, but actual recovery time. I'm grounding you for 30 days. Non-negotiable. Voss wanted to keep fighting but recognized futility. She was grounded. She'd endure it because she had no choice. The 30 days felt like prison sentence. Voss attended mandatory counseling sessions with the psychologist, where she gave carefully neutral answers designed to satisfy requirements without revealing the depth of her brokenness. She attended the physical therapy sessions Chen mandated, working to address the muscle strain and joint damage from flying combat missions in her 50s. And she waited, counting hours until she could return to flying, return to purpose, return to the only thing that made sense. On day 23 of her grounding, Webb found her again. The SEAL lieutenant had heard about the mission and come to Kandahar specifically to see her. "Ma'am, I just wanted to tell you that Foster's entire company knows what you did. They're calling you the guardian angel of Kandahar. There's talk about naming their operations center after you." Voss looked at him tiredly. "Lieutenant, please tell them not to. I don't want buildings or awards or recognition. I just want to fly." Webb sat down next to her on the bench outside the medical facility. They watched aircraft taking off and landing, the constant rhythm of war that continued regardless of individual circumstances. Captain Foster said you saved his life, all his men. He said you kept attacking even after your aircraft was shot to pieces. Why?" Voss was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Because my daughter is dead, Lieutenant, and I can't save her. But I can save other people's daughters and sons and mothers and fathers. That's all I have. That's all I am." Webb had no response to that raw honesty. They sat in silence while the sun set behind the mountains and the base lights came on and the war continued. Eventually Webb stood to leave. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. Not because you're fearless, I think you're scared all the time, but because you keep showing up anyway. That's real courage." Voss nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. Bravery felt like the wrong word. Compulsion was closer. Necessity was probably most accurate. Day 30 arrived. Voss reported to the flight surgeon's office for her evaluation. Chen reviewed her charts, ran his tests, and finally nodded. "You're cleared for flight status, but Major, I need you to promise me something. If you start having physical symptoms, chest pain, shortness of breath, anything unusual, you ground yourself immediately. Your body has limits even if you don't acknowledge them." Voss agreed because it was the path of least resistance. She'd fly until her body failed completely, or the military forced her to stop. Those were the only two acceptable endpoints. She checked in with operations and learned that her aircraft, the one she'd brought back from the dead, was still in maintenance. Kim and his team had been working to rebuild it, but the damage was extensive. They needed to replace entire wing sections, swap out hydraulic systems, repair structural damage to the fuselage. The aircraft that emerged would be more rebuilt than original, but it would fly. In the meantime, Voss was assigned a different tail number, a different A-10 that lacked the history and scarring of her previous bird. Her first flight back was a local training mission, requalifying after the extended grounding. She took off into the crystalline Afghan sky and felt the familiar relief of being airborne, of having purpose and mission and the mechanical companionship of an aircraft that responded to her commands. The A-10 flew perfectly, as they always did, not graceful or fast but absolutely competent, exactly what it needed to be. She ran through her training syllabus, executing maneuvers with precision that hadn't diminished despite the month grounded. The next day brought a combat mission. A convoy needed armed overwatch during a movement through dangerous territory. Voss flew overhead for 4 hours, watching roads and tree lines and compounds, ready to respond if the convoy came under fire. It was uneventful. The enemy chose not to engage that day. But Voss felt the satisfaction of providing protection, of being useful, of fulfilling her purpose. She landed tired but whole, ready to do it again tomorrow. September turned to October. Voss flew steadily, accumulating missions, protecting ground forces, living in the narrow space where she felt most complete. Other pilots noticed that she'd changed slightly after the near-death experience. She was more careful about aircraft preservation, less willing to accept unnecessary damage, more conscious of the line between acceptable risk and recklessness. It was a subtle shift, but significant. She'd learned that martyrdom accomplished nothing if it just removed capability from the battle space. Better to survive and fly again tomorrow. Kim finished the rebuild of her original aircraft in early November. "Ma'am, she's ready," he said, gesturing to the A-10 that looked nearly new despite bearing the same tail number as the destroyed bird. "We replaced probably 60% of her structure, but she's essentially the same aircraft. Same avionics package, same weapon systems. Should fly exactly like you remember." Voss walked around the aircraft, seeing the seams where new metal met old, the visible evidence of death and resurrection. "You did beautiful work, Sergeant Kim, thank you." She flew the rebuilt aircraft on a shakedown flight, testing systems and handling characteristics, reestablishing the relationship between pilot and machine. Everything felt right. The A-10 responded to her commands with familiar precision, reliable as gravity, tough as the mountains it flew over. She landed satisfied that the rebuild was complete, that her aircraft had been given second chance just as she had. Both of them were scarred and patched and still flying. That felt appropriate. November brought news that her Air Force Cross nomination had been approved. The ceremony would be held at Kandahar before her deployment ended. Voss tried to decline, arguing operational necessity, but was overruled by everyone from her squadron commander up through the wing commander to General Kessler himself. "Major Voss, you're receiving this award. That's not negotiable. Consider it a direct order." She stopped arguing because orders were orders, even when they felt pointless. The ceremony was held on a clear December morning. Personnel from across the base gathered, ground forces who'd been protected by her flying, pilots who considered her the standard for combat excellence, maintenance crews who'd kept her aircraft mission-ready through hundreds of sorties. Major General Kessler flew in specifically to present the award, along with Foster and his Rangers who stood in formation as honor guard. Kessler read the citation in his command voice that carried across the assembled formation. Major Natalia Voss distinguished herself by extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy. On August 15th, while providing close air support to an ambushed Ranger company, Major Voss engaged enemy forces with exceptional skill and complete disregard for her own safety. Despite sustaining catastrophic damage to her aircraft and repeated warnings to eject, she continued pressing attacks until friendly forces could safely extract. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 117 American service members who would otherwise have been killed or captured. He pinned the Air Force Cross to her uniform, a silver cross with an eagle in the center suspended from a blue ribbon, second only to the Medal of Honor. Voss stood at attention, feeling the weight of it, the expectation it carried, the legend it would cement. She'd spent her career avoiding recognition, and now she was receiving one of the highest decorations the military could bestow. It felt wrong. But when Foster and his Rangers saluted her, when the assembled personnel erupted in applause, she understood that this wasn't really about her. It was about acknowledging that extraordinary sacrifice happened, that courage existed, that some people still believed service meant something. So she accepted the award with appropriate dignity and thanked everyone for their support and returned to flying as soon as the ceremony ended. December marked the end of her deployment. Voss rotated stateside once again, returning to Nellie's and her instructor duties. But something had changed. Her students now approached her differently, not just with respect but with something approaching reverence. The female pilot with the old call sign who'd nearly died protecting Rangers, who'd flown a shot-up aircraft 70 miles to save it, who now wore the Air Force Cross for valor. She transcended from competent instructor to living legend. And legends carried different burdens than ordinary pilots. Her classes swelled with students requesting placement specifically to learn from her. Officers came from other services to observe her teaching methods. The weapons school began using her combat recordings as case studies for extraordinary airmanship under fire. Voss tolerated all of it with the same flat patience she'd always shown, teaching the same lessons, demanding the same standards, refusing to soften or compromise or make training easier just because students thought she was someone special. In February, the Air Force promoted her to lieutenant colonel. The promotion was early, ahead of normal timeline, recognition of exceptional performance and sustained combat excellence. With the promotion came expectation of squadron command, of staff positions, of career trajectory that would take her further from the cockpit and closer to administrative responsibilities she had no interest in. Voss accepted the rank because refusing was impossible, but she made clear her intention to continue flying as long as regulations and health permitted. "Sir, I appreciate the promotion," she told her new commander, a brigadier general named Thornton who'd just taken over Nellie's operations. "But I need you to understand that I'm a pilot first, administrator distant second. If you need me in staff positions, I'll serve. But my priority is flying and teaching flying. That's where I provide maximum value." Thornton, who'd read her entire service record and understood exactly who he was dealing with, nodded agreement. "Lieutenant Colonel, you'll maintain your primary duty as instructor pilot, but I do need you to take some leadership responsibilities in the A-10 division. Fair compromise." Voss agreed because it was reasonable. She could lead the division while staying connected to flying. She'd mentor younger instructors, ensure curriculum quality, maintain standards. But she'd do it while still strapping into the cockpit regularly, because the moment she stopped flying was the moment her purpose evaporated. The division leadership role came with additional administrative burden she despised, but it was manageable. She delegated ruthlessly, trusting her people to handle details, while she focused on the essential work of training pilots who'd eventually deploy to combat. Spring brought changes to the training syllabus. The Air Force was considering retiring the A-10 again, the perennial debate that resurfaced every few years when budget analysts looked at the platform's age and maintenance costs without understanding its irreplaceable capabilities. Voss fought the proposal through every channel available, writing position papers that detailed the A-10's combat effectiveness, gathering testimony from ground commanders who understood what losing the platform would mean. She became voice of resistance against short-sighted planning that valued spreadsheets over battlefield reality. Her arguments, backed by